Hello everyone, welcome to General Psychology, Psychology 101, and today we're going to be talking about development in adolescence and adulthood. So once individuals reach adolescence, there are a lot of changes that are going on. Puberty, for example, is a pretty big physical change that happens, but there is a psychological impact to puberty. This can be extremely stressful. We can see a lot of moodiness. The timing of puberty can have a pretty big impact on individuals' well-being. This can also lead to issues with eating and body image. So we see a lot of eating disorders such as anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and other eating disorders rear their ugly head within adolescence. In terms of cognitive development, we see a lot of new skills. So if we think about Piaget's cognitive development theory, we're into the formal operational stage. We're thinking more abstractly, more systematically, more scientifically about the world. We're using more internal reflections. We start to think about thinking using metacognition. Especially in adolescence, we see people thinking about the self more, having more egocentric views. So they think that everyone is focusing on them, that they are special and unique and no one else is like them, focusing on the self. We see some changes in planning and decision making, so being able to self-regulate, being able to monitor how successfully a person is towards attaining goals. And we start to see some divergence in genders. We start to see girls tend to be better in reading and writing achievement, whereas boys tend to perform better in math. So what about personality development? Well, we start to see a focus more on developing an identity, who you are, your values, and what kind of direction you want to take in life. Self-esteem can play a pretty large role in this. And there are a lot of other influences on self-esteem that we need to take account. Along with personality continuing to develop, we also see morality and moral standards develop a lot within late childhood and into adolescence. Kohlberg's theory of moral development focuses on different levels of morality or moral understanding. Pre-conventional levels is focusing on kind of external rules or guidelines for morality. Conventional level focuses on kind of maintaining order within the current social system, not necessarily rules and laws, but kind of social norms or what people are supposed to do. And post-conventional level takes it to kind of a higher order level. Morality in terms of these abstract principles that all people in the world should abide by. We also see a lot of development in adolescence in terms of social development. At this stage, individuals are interacting with peers more than they're interacting with their family. And we start to see adolescents really start to grasp what it takes to live in a society, to interact and try and balance many different relationships, interactions on a day-to-day basis. We see development in relationships with parents, with siblings, with close friends, with peer groups, and also with sexual relationships, with dating. We see peer pressure rear its ugly head, and the fact that people are interacting with others on a more frequent basis and are worrying about their social status on a large scale. We start to see some psychological disorders become more frequent, such as anxiety and such as depression and suicide. As adolescents begin to transition into adulthood, we see an interesting stage, what's known as emerging adulthood. That's where adolescents that's where individuals are no longer adolescents. They're no longer teenagers. They are, by how we would typically define them, considered adults. But they still rely a lot on their parents. They are still trying to figure out who they are. Once individuals actually reach adulthood, we start to see interesting changes. It's kind of a transitional period from adolescence into adulthood, especially because we start to see physical declines now. We no longer see a whole lot of physical developments. And this can have serious psychological implications as well. Especially as we get into older adulthood, we start to see a lot of important systems fail, whether it be vision, whether it be hearing, whether it be our physical body through fat, through muscle, etc., whether it be our reproductive systems, or serious illness that can lead to death. We start to be very aware of our mortality as we enter adulthood, and that only gets more and more intense as we get into middle and late adulthood. What about cognitive development in adulthood? Well, we do see some relatively new skills emerge, such as epistemic cognition, such as pragmatic thought, for example. But for the most part, we see declines in mental ability and processing. Sometimes we do see advantages in competencies, so certain levels of intelligence, such as crystallized intelligence, and we're able to accumulate a lot of knowledge or intelligence via this manner just because we've lived and existed for longer. But the types of intelligence, such as fluid intelligence that rely on information processing, these start to decline because we're just simply not able to process information as quickly as possible. We can't pay attention to everything as much as we used to. We can't remember things. And we also have issues in problem solving. In terms of personality development, we start to see a larger focus on lasting legacies. So focusing on intimacy, trying to find a partner that you can spend the rest of your life with. We focus on generativity, that's kind of passing on your breadth of knowledge and your genes down onto your children so that they're living long and healthy lives. And then ego integrity. Have I accomplished what I want to in my life, and am I satisfied with who I've become as a person? This latter stage focuses a lot on self-actualization, or transcending yourself, understanding that the legacy that you've left in the world is not just you, but it's what you've passed on maybe to your children and your grandchildren and the other ways you've influenced the world. We see some interesting developments in adulthood in terms of the relationships that we form. We kind of focus on finding a mate, finding someone to marry, raising kids, possibly becoming grandparents. And one interesting fact that we encounter in adulthood, specifically middle adulthood, is what's known as the sandwich generation. That's when middle adults are caring for their kids while at the same time caring for their aging parents. So they're kind of sandwiched in between these two generations. Early in adulthood and somewhat into middle adulthood, we see that focus becomes on not only with family, but also career. Trying to figure out, again, in emerging adulthood, we're trying to figure out who am I and what do I want to do with my life. Once we enter adulthood, we need to actually put that to fruition, actually follow through with it. And a lot of times the careers that people gravitate towards are based on the type of personalities that individuals have. So, for example, investigative personalities may focus on more scientific jobs, whereas artistic personalities may focus on the ways in which they can express their artistic values or personalities. So at the end of adulthood, we reach the end of our lives, and this is where we have to come to terms with the fact that we may be dying and the inevitability of death. The process of dying is, unfortunately, more often than not long and drawn out, and it's often a complicated process. And it's not only complicated for the person who's dying, but it's also complicated for the individuals who are close to that person, family members, friends, etc. Within more recent generations, these individuals are more separated from death. They haven't experienced death as much as older generations rather have. So even within studying developmental psychology, we see that what may have occurred in previous generations no longer applies to this new generation who don't have as much experience with death. For this reason, we see interesting developments in how children understand what death is and what death means. We see this transition into adolescence where these kids tend to have unreasonable understandings of death, where they think they can do anything and get away with it. And as people start to enter adulthood with especially physical declines, adults tend to be much more aware of their own mortality, and they start to behave in ways which suggest that they are thinking about their own deaths. Most of you are probably familiar with these stages of dying, Kubler-Ross's model, where we start with denial, move on to anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And for the most part, this does apply to how people react to death, but it's not as kind of stringent and straightforward as you might think. There is a little bit of variability in not only which stages a person experiences, but the order in which people experience these stages. And lastly, family members deal with deaths in very different ways. People can avoid them, people can confront them directly, or people can focus on restoration. That's kind of keeping them in the thoughts while still moving on with their lives. And this can differ by gender, this can differ depending on whether it's a parent or a grandparent or a child or a significant other. But in all situations, it is often very difficult to deal with death, and a lot of negative outcomes can occur unless the individual who has lost a family member has strong social support around them. So that's all I have for today. Thank you for your time and attention, and I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.